Well, welcome to the second webinar in this Pathways to Employment series, which focuses on how high-quality assessment can inform the pursuit of in- and post-school employment for students with disabilities. If we're going to tailor individually our transition services and supports for our students, then meaningful transition assessment helps us identify which educational practices and experiences are really most essential for each of the individuals that we serve. But what should our assessment practices look like, and why does this matter? Well, this webinar is designed to help you learn why high-quality assessment is just so critical to the preparation for the world of work, and to understand and identify key features of meaningful assessment, to understand a variety of relevant assessment approaches, and to connect to practical resources in this area. Now let's start by reviewing the current transition mandates outlined in IDEA, which requires that the individualized education programs of students with disabilities include appropriate, measurable post-secondary goals based on age-appropriate transition assessments related to training, education, employment, and, where appropriate, independent living skills. In other words, transition assessment is the primary avenue for identifying which practices and programs are most essential for the individual students with significant disabilities that we serve. And rather than relying on anecdotes or assumptions, transition teams should reflect on and gather good data when designing compelling transition plans that address inclusive employment. We can determine whether the goals are appropriate because our assessment tells us this is so. And we can determine whether a transition plan will reasonably lead to good outcomes because our assessments suggest this is so. So you'll quickly see the importance of individualized assessment when reflecting on a few observations about the students with significant disabilities whom we serve. We know that every student has a different combination of strengths and needs, that they hold a dynamic and different set of interests and preferences, that they'll pursue somewhat different paths through adulthood, that they have access to different supports and resources, and they've had a range of very diverse prior experiences. And therefore, we must have a distinct and individualized transition plan for each student. Let me emphasize this point. Every student's transition plan should be different from all the others because each student you serve is different from all the others. And this is where assessment comes in. In fact, the word assess actually derives from the Latin word assedere, which means to sit beside, right? To sit beside. And I just love that image. It's a different way of thinking about assessment, not as a way to evaluate or to judge a student, but as a way to come to know a student. It kind of redeems the word for me. And through sitting alongside our students in very intentional ways and doing that over time, we can answer a number of key questions. Like, who is this young man or woman? And what does a good life look like for them? What are their work-related aspirations? Where do they shine? In what areas do they struggle? And what types of workplaces would really make a great fit? And what supports would make a great difference? What are the skills they need to learn now? And what connections could be most valuable at this time? It might be helpful to actually think back to your own experiences in middle school or high school and the ways assessment might have informed your own preparation. I suspect you took career interest inventories or assessments at some point. You may have been asked by others about your career interests at various points in time. You took a variety of achievement tests or other tests that spoke to some of your abilities and knowledge, and you likely tried out one or more jobs as a teenager where you probably learned a lot about what you like to do and what you definitely do not want to do again. You got feedback from others who knew you well and spoke about the strengths and the possibilities that they saw. And each of these forms of assessment provided you with insights about yourself and helped you inform your future plans. The same can be true for students with significant disabilities who would also benefit from similar forms of assessment all along the way. So returning back to IDEA, our employment-related transition activities, like all transition activities, must be based on the individual child's needs and taking into account the child's preferences and strengths and interests, which means we must know what those needs and strengths and preferences and interests are. This grid illustrates where our assessment should focus. In the area of living and learning and working, we have to be strategic about carrying out the sorts of transition assessments that provide us with a rich portrait of the interests and preferences and strengths and needs of our students. And when it comes to the world of work, we must identify what our students want to do and are good at doing and prefer to do, right alongside their needs for instruction and opportunities and supports in this area. But also, we revisit this portrait over time because it evolves as students accrue new experiences and encounter the instruction that we're providing along the way. So transition is a starting point for transition planning, and it's also an ongoing process that permeates all aspects of the preparation for the world of work. In your own work of trying to synthesize the transition assessment literature, at least in our own work, we've identified a dozen features that should characterize our efforts in this area of employment. We know that strong employment assessment should begin early, be ongoing, address relevant domains, incorporate multiple approaches, integrate multiple perspectives, involve the student, be culturally appropriate, reflect real-life demands, address inclusive settings, reveal critical strengths, incorporate needed adaptations, and produce informative results. So we'll walk through each of these one at a time and talk about why they matter and what it might look like. And as with all of our efforts on this pathway to employment, transition assessment should start early. Maybe not in infancy, but certainly by the time or before students turn 14. And of course, earlier assessments are broader and more general than later assessments, which are often more targeted and specific. So initially, you may look at assessments of a student's career interests or career awareness. And then later on, you might focus more on the skills and the knowledge and the behaviors that they've acquired or still need. And second, what begins early should also be ongoing. Employment-related assessments should be completed and updated each year as your students accrue new experiences and as their future plans start to take shape. In other words, assessment's not a one-time process. It's ongoing. It's not static. And most students are going to change their employment goals over time. Often they'll change them many times, and they'll be exposed to new experiences. They'll master some skills. They'll need to move on to others. They'll make progress in some areas and they'll stagnate in others. And so with each year and each transition plan, you'll revisit that assessment process to inform your work. In fact, adolescents are notorious for changing their interests and preferences and goals over time. And so old assessments should not be used to derive new goals. This ongoing approach to assessment then should also speak to multiple domains of a student's life. And while we're focusing on employment in this series, it's not the only area that matters when it comes to assessment. There's other example transition domains that are important, like employment and career development, post-secondary education, independent living skills, community participation, functional academics, interpersonal skills or social skills, technology skills, self-determination, recreation and leisure, personal management, sort of financial or money management, transportation and mobility, and health. That's just a few examples of the different transition domains. And what you'll also see is the intersection between these domains when it comes to the world of work. As we think about employment, we also have to assess and address social skills and interpersonal relationships and functional skills and technology skills and self-determination skills and transportation skills that all are evidenced in the workplace and make the difference between struggling on the job and having success on the job as well. And likewise, there may be many different aspects of the employment experience that require our attention. Let me illustrate by sharing an observational rating scale that I think could help you in assessing a student's job-related skills. We've done a number of studies over the years to identify the types of skills that are valued by most employers, particularly of kind of entry-level jobs. And they tend to fall into four categories. There's task-related work skills, task-related social behaviors, general social behaviors, and general work skills. And one explanation for high rates of turnover or even termination among some young people with significant disabilities may be that they perform poorly those skills judged to be most critical for success by their employers. So let me show you what this measure looks at and what's really covered in it. So task-related work behaviors are those non-social behaviors related to employee productivity. They include things like carrying out instructions that need immediate attention, or working continuously without getting distracted and working at the expected speed. You can observe a student in the workplace, or you can interview employers about each of these areas and then rate them on a scale that ranges from doing this very poorly to somewhat well to hopefully very well. And if you have had no opportunity to observe, you can indicate that you're unsure. Now, of course, these may not be the only behaviors that matter in a particular industry or job site. So you could ask other employers about any behaviors that they would add to this list as well. Now, the second section focuses on task-related social behaviors, which are these interactive behaviors that are directly related to the performance of job tasks. These are things like following directions, or accepting constructive criticism from a supervisor, or asking for explanations when instructions are unclear, or even requesting assistance when it's needed. And these social-related demands of a workplace can sometimes be really hard for students with complex communication needs or significant cognitive impairments, and just a struggle to navigate. And of course, there may be other job-specific behaviors too that you'd want to add or even remove from this list. Of course, non-related task behaviors are those, or what we call general social behaviors, are not really related directly to job performance, but they contribute to social inclusion and acceptance. And these can include things like using social amenities like please and thank you, or using appropriate conversational behaviors like making eye contact or appropriate volume, or even responding appropriately to joking or humor. And these are actually skills that can be practiced outside of the workplace as well as within the workplace. And then finally, there are these sort of generic behaviors that have relevance across a wide range of entry-level jobs. And they include things like returning from break or lunch on time, or knowing how to request days off work, or calling into work when you're sick or running late. And that's just one example of how multiple employment domains can really benefit from consideration throughout this assessment process. Well, fourth, a combination of informal and formal approaches is advocated when we're assessing a student's strengths and needs and interests and preferences in the area of employment. So transition assessment should incorporate information from more than one data source, more than one data collection approach when really determining a student's goals. So we don't want to rely on any single source of information. Multiple approaches are really needed. For example, teams may incorporate information gathered using direct observations, or situational or performance assessments, which are just on-the-job tryouts in a sense, or ecological inventories and task analyses, checklists and rating scales, surveys or questionnaires, interest inventories or preference assessments, interviews, teacher-made assessments, or even our person-centered planning approaches. So in my own studies of reviewing transition plans, It's not uncommon to see a student interview as the only or the dominant source of assessment information. And of course, asking the student about this area is absolutely important, but more information is needed than that. For example, a student might say they like a particular type of job, and then you'd want to observe them doing that job well and enjoying it immensely. And then you might want to interview an employer or a job coach that confirms all of this information. And what you're really doing is looking for the convergence of information across these approaches, particularly when employment-related decisions have kind of higher stakes or greater implications as well. Now, direct observations can be especially insightful. And so here's an example of just an observational sheet that was used to gauge the extent to which Evan was performing various social and task-related responsibilities at his work-based learning site at Macy's. And so tracking this information over time helps us with both instructional decisions and also determine whether this job really is a particular fit or interest for Evan as well. And so those observations can be really informative in this area. Now, another example of an assessment that could integrate both direct observations and interviews with others is a social skills checklist. So this one includes a dozen social-related skills that are often highly valued within a workplace. And they each can be related based on the frequency with which the job is exhibited, like always, sometimes, or never. And of course, some items just might not be applicable to certain jobs, and you can indicate that in the final column as well. So it's just a good way to sort of do that kind of assessment by focusing specifically on job-related social skills. Now, one essential element of high-quality employment assessment, or even employment planning at all, involves integrating the perspectives of multiple individuals who know a student well and who are familiar with the expectations of their current or future work environments in which a student is already participating or may participate in the future. So this approach is really advocated because the scope of transition planning is usually broader than other educational planning endeavors. It addresses multiple domains, on and off campus contexts, different time points, and different support systems. And so each member of the transition planning team is going to have a different vantage point from which to observe a student, and they may all hold different expectations about the transition domains that are most important to address for a student. And they may each compile different information about a student's competence and support needs. These kind of multi-informant approaches may be particularly important when we're conducting transition planning for students who have complex needs, complex communication needs, or who just have difficulty articulating their own goals or interests or strengths and support needs. So this reliance on multiple proxy informants can be heightened when employment planning focuses on students with significant disabilities. And it helps really provide the most accurate and relevant portrait of a student. So employment assessment draws upon input from those individuals who are really in the best position to evaluate a student's interests and strengths and preferences and needs in this area. So think about who might bring their valued perspectives, like students or special educators or family members or vocational educators or related service providers. You might want to hear from paraprofessionals or job coaches or pre-employment transition services providers, or even employers or coworkers or others I haven't named who just might be able to speak to this issue of employment. All of this reduces the bias that can come from reliance on a single person. But it also helps you identify places of alignment where multiple people agree, and also places of disagreement where two or more people don't quite see things exactly the same. And in fact, divergence in viewpoints is actually quite common in the assessment process. For example, in one of our transition assessment studies that involved 135 adolescents with significant disabilities, we looked at how the views of parents and teachers either converged or diverged in this area of employment. And we used something called the Transition Planning Inventory. Each of the 5 items in this section of employment was rated on a 1 to 5 scale. And then parents and teachers could also indicate that they didn't know, which is DK, or that an item was not applicable, or NA. And here's what we found. Actually, less than half of the time, 46% of the time, items were rated exactly the same way by parents and teachers. 27% of the time, parents and teachers provided different numeric ratings. 16% of the time, one person gave a rating and the other person said the item wasn't applicable. And 6% of the time, one person gave a rating and the other person said they didn't know. And this isn't just an issue in employment, but in all areas as well. The key is to see divergence as a catalyst for discussion. It's not a problem per se. In other words, we want to understand why different people assess a student in different ways. Now, of course, it's always important to involve the student. Transition assessment should actively engage the student in providing or even gathering assessment information about his or her own strengths and interests and preferences and needs. Now, this certainly contributes to their own self-awareness, their own self-determination, but it also increases their own buy-in to their transition plan. Now, the challenge we find for many teachers and parents is to gradually shift this focus of employment goal setting from parents and teachers as the primary determiners of transition goals, which puts them at the forefront, to starting to shift to having youth and young adults with disabilities we work with who have complex communication needs or behavioral challenges to being the forefront of determining what they want in their lives. And that's hard. That requires the best of our creativity and persistence, but it really is important work. So my point here is that our assessment practices should serve to both honor and enhance the self-determination of the students with whom we work, and that they should be at the forefront of these goals with us and families in the backdrop. And so it kind of, as this optical illusion sort of illustrates, you kind of have to learn to shift your perspectives. And that might lead to greater motivation to work. But there are also situations where the student is the only or best person who can speak to an issue. And that's true of the area of job satisfaction. And so we've created a very simple form as a way of students being able to rate what they like and don't like about their work-based learning site or a paid job. Now, each of these is rated from I'm very unhappy to I'm very happy with each aspect of the job. And of course, with following from the previous point about multiple approaches, you could combine this rating scale with open-ended questions, with direct observations, or through interviews with others at the job site to get their feedback as well. Now, we must also make sure that we are using transition assessments that are culturally and linguistically appropriate for our students. We know that some assessments are only available in certain languages. Others cover topics that might have less important for students from certain backgrounds. So be culturally and linguistically appropriate. Transition assessment should be available in the language of each student and his or her family. It should be carried out in ways that are culturally sensitive, and it should address areas of importance to the student and their family. And this is something that can be challenging amidst the real paucity of transition assessments for diverse populations. And so you may have to make your own or adapt existing assessments to fulfill this purpose. Well, eighth, employment assessment should reflect real life demands. It should address the specific skills and knowledge and behavior and attitudes and supports that the students will actually need to be successful in the sort of post-school employment context for which he or she is preparing. In other words, selected assessments should closely mirror the actual demands of future environments. And conversely, simulated environments should not be used as a substitute for assessment in actual environments. This usually means that assessment shifts from on campus to off campus as students get older and approach graduation. Assessments that resemble real life demands give way to those that actually reflect real life demands. And obviously, this introduces real logistical challenges that are going to really require your creativity to solve. But the more you can look at a student's actual performance in an actual business, the better positions you're going to be to speak to their actual abilities and needs. You just can't simulate a job meaningfully from the classroom, right? The social demands, the quality demands, the problem-solving demands, they all look different in the community than in the classroom. And so you could see this progression of school-based to community-based experiences that's evident in this list of career-related opportunities that a student might participate in over time, right? Some take place on campus, others off campus, but the culminating experience for all of our students should be real jobs for real pay in the community. So you can assess what opportunities have your students have had from this list and what are still needed. Well, ninth, this really leads to the next point pretty directly, actually. Employment assessments should address the skills and the knowledge and behaviors and attitudes or supports that students need to participate in integrated settings. Integrated community settings right alongside other persons with disabilities. And that should happen in the community. We know that students with significant disabilities struggle to generalize from the classroom to other locations. And so best practices emphasize preparation for paid integrated employment in the community. And as a result, community-based experiences should dominate as students get older. Well, 10th, make sure that the assessments that you are using lead you to a better understanding of the strengths and positive traits that your students possess. And there is, this is really a point I emphasized really heavily in that first webinar. We know that connections to jobs and social relationships and most community activities are usually made on the basis of personal strengths and potential contributions, not on the basis of deficits. If all we know about a young person with a disability is what he or she cannot do, it's not surprising that others struggle to envision a place for them in their workplaces or even in other community settings. So knowing what your students can do is as important or maybe more important than knowing what they can't do. So make sure to adopt a strengths-based emphasis as part of your approach to transition assessment. Ask people what they see in the student. Notice the things that people compliment them on. Identify the places where they really do shine. Now, of course, most transition assessments were not designed with students with significant disabilities in mind. And so you'll need to incorporate adaptations and modifications and other things so that the student can actively participate in the process and an accurate assessment can really be obtained. This is really, really important for students with significant disabilities. And so there are a number of good guides on how to do this well. I'd like to just point you to one that our team has created that highlights general principles around adaptations, as well as some creative ways of using high-tech and low-tech approaches to adapting assessments. So this might include things like using visual aids or incorporating augmentative and alternative communication devices or AAC devices, and also giving students multiple ways of responding. And finally, good employment assessment should directly inform transition planning. It should produce informative results that guide the work of transition planning. So transition assessments should be shared with the team and communicated in clearly understandable ways, including not only for the student, but also for the family. So think right at the outset about how you're going to summarize and synthesize the findings of your assessments in ways that will facilitate discussions with the transition planning team and ultimately lead directly to goal development. Well, there you have it. That's a dozen considerations for carrying out strong employment assessment. It should begin early. It should be ongoing. It should address multiple and relevant domains. It should incorporate multiple approaches and integrate multiple perspectives. And of course, it should involve the student because this is their transition plan to employment. And we have to understand what they desire and what they think and what they prefer and where they see their strengths and needs falling. And of course, it should be culturally appropriate to make sure that each assessment we use aligns with the different linguistic and cultural needs of our students. Eighth, it should reflect real-life demands and address inclusive settings, which means that more and more our assessment should happen in the places where students work and are doing work-based learning. 10th, it should reveal critical strengths. It should incorporate needed adaptations. And at the end of the day, it really should produce strong, informative results that are understandable to all members of the transition planning team, including ourselves. In other words, we have to know how that assessment will be compiled and shared in ways that make it really clear what our next steps would be as a transition planning team as well. So of course, if we're going to capture a compelling portrait of each student's interests and preferences and strengths and needs, we're going to need good assessment tools. If you aren't sure where to find them, let me point you to our free assessment database where you can search for assessments in the area of employment as well as other different domains as well. So it's a chance to find assessments that are needed across all of the areas that are relevant to transition, but particularly to dive deeper into what's available in the area of employment. So what's beautiful about this assessment database is it allows you to search for tools by domain, by focus in terms of strengths, interests, needs, and preferences, by approach, including all the areas that we discussed earlier around interests or interviews and observations and task analyses and situational assessments and teacher-made assessments and even person-centered planning approaches. It allows you to find assessments that draw upon those different approaches in case there's ones you need in particular. It also allows you to search by a disability category. Now, we would caution you about using this too heavily because most assessments aren't intended for a particular disability, but rather are more broad-based as well. You can search for this assessments by language. And now, that also is a limiting factor because most assessments aren't really available in terms of these multiple languages beyond English, Spanish, French, and sometimes ASL. So you may have to draw upon translators in your own district or state to be able to help adapt those. Also, what's interesting is you can search by who completes the assessment. So if you're wanting to find assessments that can be completed by students or parents or special educators or someone at a work site or any or all of these, you can search there as well. And finally, you can search by cost, which I know sort of excites you because there are so many of these assessments that are free or low cost. Now, I'd encourage you not to simply only rely on those that are free or low cost, but to advocate within your district for some purchases of assessments that are really broad and valuable, but also do have some cost to them. So I encourage you to check that out. I think you'll find a lot of resources that really guide you in each of these areas as well. Now, likewise, I want to emphasize that the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition, called the Collaborative or the NTACT Collaborative, has also produced a resource around age-appropriate transition assessment. So it's kind of a toolkit that provides also an overview of available assessments across domains, but it does have a few names related to employment specifically. So when you think about these two tools together, that should give you kind of a very robust and comprehensive look at what assessments I might draw upon to help people navigate this transition to the world of work as well. So I hope those are really helpful and help you identify those places where you can find multiple approaches and culturally appropriate approaches, and ones that involve the student and one that reflect real life demands. Those tools are available. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can draw upon some of the tools that are already out there. And as I emphasized earlier, you can also make sure that you are adapting those tools and personalizing them based on the needs of your students. And that's entirely appropriate when it comes to transition assessment, to modify language or wording if it helps you acquire that kind of portrait of students in all those areas of strengths, needs, interests, and preferences. Well, I hope this webinar has really prompted your own thinking about the ways in which you assess students for meaningful employment. It takes time to do this work well, but honestly, it's an investment that will reap rich dividends for your students and for the transition team. This is really about sitting alongside your student and sitting alongside them over time so that you can really discern the very best portrait of who this student is, what their passions are, where they might find a great fit in the workplace, and what kinds of skills and knowledge and behaviors they're going to need to be able to thrive in those environments. A high quality assessment for meaningful employment is so fundamental to all that we'll talk about in the other webinars as well. And so please join me for those other webinars in this Pathways to Employment series, where I think you'll find examples of how assessment can inform our work in this area, additional examples as it relates to assessment for employment or summer employment, assessment to inform our work with businesses, or even ways of identifying assessments that can be applied to our community as a whole to make sure we're tapping into the strengths and interests and opportunities that lie right in our midst. So thank you for your work on behalf of students with significant disabilities, the care that you already put into learning about who they are and what they need. And I just commend you for that work and hope that these resources and strategies that we've shared will really help propel you further as you think about doing this work of transition really well. So thank you, and I look forward to seeing you in some of the other webinars that are part of this series.